space, as I told, just a hackerspace, which you can find in many places on Earth. This one, it was founded a couple of years ago, and still active because of guys like you programming here. And actually, I hope that after the event, some of you will stay, we will have some movie night, we will watch hackers, so it's a great event. And I hope that you will like the evening, and after that, we assume that you can support our tooling and our community here by some donation, any kind of donation there. So I think that's it. We can start and enjoy. This is a Vincent, but I'm not familiar with your last name. But I don't think it matters. So Vincent is our guest from US, which is also a quite talented and really skilled guy in many mediums and mediums in general. So he will tell you, I think, Mike show who start today.
Cool. Thanks.
So yeah.
All right. So my name is Vincent. My handle is DRMBT. I'm a media artist that works a lot with projection mapping, with applications like Touch Designer, Adobe Suite, Resolute Marina, and the last few years been using a lot of AI and machine learning tools in my process. I wanted to share some process from a project that I did this last year. This was a concert series called Ambient Church, and they do these all over the US, but mostly in New York. I did 3 of these events last year, and I learned a lot and developed a few interesting techniques during this time that I felt like might be nice to share. Before we get started, just real quick, does anyone work with projectors or projection mapping here? No, okay, so this is new. How about Touch Designer? Anyone? Yeah. Touch Designer?
Yeah, raise hand.
Okay. Adobe Suite, Premiere, After Effects, these sorts of things, anyone? Okay. And how about AI tools? Who's worked a little bit with some AI? Okay. So we've got, LLMs, we have image generation, things like Midjourney, and I'm mostly interested in the open source side of AI tooling. Does everyone know about Stable Diffusion? Does anyone raise your hand if you've heard? Okay. So Stable Diffusion is kind of the open source side of the generative AI image creation tool set. It was made by a company called Stability AI, and while you have Midjourney or DALL-E and different OpenAI kinds of big corporate commercial models, Stable Diffusion was kind of the first time that we as an open source community got access to really powerful image generation models. And what's been really fascinating following the tooling and the growth of the open source community around these generative tool sets is that open source is always a little bit behind the commercial offering. But because there's so many people working with these tools and contributing, the ecosystem is really rich and deep. And it's been really fascinating to watch how, even though we're not working on these huge data center compute clusters or with these bazillion parameter models, the open source community has really found a lot of interesting ways to expand and extend these tools in a way that makes them, in some respects, a lot more customizable and a lot more controllable than what you're going to get from locked down corporate AI. Not the least of which is censorship. If anybody's ever tried to work with ChatGPT or different kinds of commercial models, you might ask a question or try to generate even a very benign image and find yourself really frustrated because the censorship is really strong. The other thing is that most of these commercial tools are not built with creators that are production studios or specialists or technical artists in mind. Most of them are built with lowest common denominator, general consumer grade kind of features built in. And that means that if you want to have a lot of control or use things like guidance shapes, it's been a lot more difficult, and you have a lot more control using the open source stuff, which is also a little bit more complicated, higher learning curve to get comfortable with. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of or used Comfy UI. Okay, cool. So a handful of people have used Comfy. Comfy UI is a node-based web user interface that originally was used for Stable Diffusion image generation. It was created by an ex-employee of Stability AI as kind of a personal toolkit. He released it on GitHub, and before you knew it, it had grown into this like pretty huge open source monster. They've been around for just over 2 years now and have already kind of found themselves in what I think is a position that mimics almost what the Blender Foundation has done. They started a foundation. The biggest contributors to the open source project are all working together now as a company and as a nonprofit foundation. There's thousands of contributors to the project, tens of thousands of node makers for it, and the scope of the project has grown really significantly. We now have people using it to do all kinds of things outside of AI inference. Beyond image generation or video generation or LLM generation, you have people rebuilding Photoshop inside of it, people making audio tools and different traditional VFX pipelines inside of it. And it's really a JavaScript front end with a Python back end that's super extensible, super deployable. And I'm really bullish on the future for this project because I believe that eventually the AI part will be negligible and people will just see this as a really straight ahead and hackable interface for Python inference with whatever kind of JavaScript front end you might want to build for it. You see people making Doom in the browser for it. You see people making all kinds of different interfaces and games, and we could rebuild Figma or any number of things inside of this platform. So I'm going to kind of go through my tool stack a little bit. This is some clips from this church project, and I'm going to basically go through and talk about how I started with this project, how I approached it, and what the workflow ends up looking like in order to build something like custom visuals for this using Touch Designer, which is also a node-based programming environment. Has anyone ever worked with Houdini?
Houdini.
So Houdini and Touch Designer are distant cousins. One of the ground floor founders of Houdini, of Side Effects, left and started Touch Designer because he wanted Houdini to be running real-time 60 frames per second. He wanted it to be more of an interactive VJ tool. And when they started building this, they used it as an internal studio tool that they eventually released commercially. It gets used in art installations, museums, galleries, music festivals. Early days of their company, they were doing installations for Disney theme parks and Universal Studios. Really anywhere that you need a computer to take real-time information and make other things happen. So it's great for working with sensors, with projectors, robots, lasers, VR, AR, web APIs, kind of a whole gamut of things that computers can do. Touch Designer becomes this orchestration layer for rapid prototyping of all these ins and outs. So it's like a big box of Legos where you can do just about anything that you want. This is what Touch Designer looks like. You have different nodes that you're plugging into each other in order to make things happen. I'm going to show you one of the projects that I made for this church system. And I guess the first place to start here is what I was given. So this is the raw image of the church that I was given. And actually, it's not the raw image, this is a prepared image. You can see the raw image here. There's a bunch of bullshit in the foreground. And this is as close to the perspective of the projector as we could get. But I wasn't even in New York at the time when I got this gig, so the event organizer went to the balcony of the church that we were going to be mapping and took a photo with his phone and sent it to me. It was a pretty good photo, but not perfect. And the perspective is a little bit off, the height isn't where you might want it. So the first thing that I did was clean that up. And by cleaning that up, I used AI and Photoshop in order to remove a bunch of things from the foreground. I did a little bit of outpainting on some of the edges in order to give myself a little bit of headroom. I painted, a 16 by 9 or 16 by 10, actually the other way, 10 by 16 perspective chunk around here to see what kind of coverage my projector was going to get. And then I took it into Lightroom in order to adjust the perspective and try to create as flat and as straight of a beginning map as possible. Anybody who's worked with 3D might be familiar with UV mapping, and this is kind of what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to create, even if it's not perfect, a really flat source of truth that I can use in order to start composing content before I'm live on site at the gig. So the very first thing to do from there is once I had my flattened image, I brought this into Photoshop and did the kind of tedious work of manually drawing in all of my masks with a pen tool. Creating these different chunks and layers for myself so that I could create masks. Here's a mask around the outside of what I'd planned on uncovering. Here's a mask specifically just for this altar, and taking all of these different chunks and spitting out groups that I could use in order to put different pieces of content inside of different parts of the composition. So maybe I only want to put one layer of content on this trim here. Maybe I only want to put a layer of content in the panels over here as a background. By having these different masks on different layers inside of my VJ software, I can do that. I can put just fire behind here, or sky in the ceiling, or some sort of generative geometry and patterns in order to kind of composite in real time and improvise with the shape of the space. The most important piece that comes out of this entire little operation is an outline. And this outline is going to be my source of truth for the job. All right, so starting here with this outline, this is where I begin in order to start projection mapping onto my surface. And if all of my content matches this perfectly, then all I need to do when I get to the job is make sure that this matches the best as I can to the geometry. And that happens through a process called mesh warping. So when you're working with, let me actually pull in that mask. So a piece of content such as this one. This program is called Resolume Arena, and this is kind of the industry standard. This might have been a mistake, but I think that file's on Google Drive, and that means this is really slow. One second. That was a bad idea. Alright, there we go. So of content that looks like this. Basically, I'm taking my content and then I'm doing all kinds of tiny little warping when I'm projecting that back onto the space in order to get to a point where it's as matched as perfectly as I can possibly get it with the surface. And so you have to account for lens distortion, you have to account for variations in how flat your projector actually is. But if you've got a really nice guide as a starting point like this, and you know what you're doing, it doesn't take a crazy amount of time. I think I did this mapping in about 35 minutes, which was fast.
From the place?
I'm sorry?
You're making this mapping from the place?
Yeah. And so once you've got a nice clean map on your spot, no, not this one, this one. So once you've got your map on the space, now your visual content is going to fit perfectly to the surfaces that you're working on. Takes a little bit of time, but once you've got that going, now you're ready to pop that on. So you can see we're trying to mask that as perfectly as possible, and then you can put different pieces of content in different parts and get creative with these individual masks. So I spent a lot of time on the very first gig working in Touch Designer in order to make things like generative light beams where the masks might emit some sort of directional corpuscular rays, God rays, beams of light. I made an implementation that mimics how a laser projector works, drawing a vector image along the points of the path. And then I finally, for the second gig, made something interesting by creating a fake depth map using AI in order to get real-time lighting effects on my process. So with this, I set up a little bit of a mouse situation, and I'm basically creating a single plane and then offsetting that by a depth map in order to have what appears to be a three-dimensional surface. And that means that if I move the light and the lights look at point in opposite relationship to each other, I can create these shadows that are fake light sources, but that appear real. And so I think I've got a clip pulled that talks about that. Where'd that one go? Here we go. So you can see my screen live in the gig, and also the actual wall itself as I manipulate and scrub through these different depth maps that I created and use the mouse in order to kind of paint with light in real time. There's kind of a reddish hue lookup table on the light in order to give it that color, that warmth. But it was just another fun way to kind of work with these tools, using AI but in non-traditional ways. The way that I created these depth maps is in Comfy UI, a process that I was just running here at the beginning because it takes kind of a while. So basically you put in an image and then you send it to a whole host of AI preprocessors. And these are tools that get used as guidance when you're making image generation. So we have different AI segmentation masks right here. And you can see that some of these are better than others. In fact, some of these are downright terrible. And then you also have edge processors. And again, some are better than others. Not bad for free, but you can tell why I still had to manually in Photoshop drawing with a pen tool my masks if I wanted a really clean, really consistent guidance. You can see like some of these are viable. This one's getting pretty close, and it's definitely good enough for image generation if I just want to make something that is pretty close.
All of these are still derived from your original one photo, right?
All of these are derived from my original photo. Well, my original prepared photo, once I cleaned it up with AI and changed the force perspective.
But you could have had an easier time with like a few different lighting situations to get like better edges like, on site in the paintwood.
Potentially, but I don't think any of it was going to be perfect, and I would much rather have an imperfect image as a starting point where I can kind of make executive decisions and draw that in, and then I know everything's going to be perfect to my content, and then force that into place.
Yeah, also I have a question about the edge separation or like highlighting. Is it just available with simple filters in Photoshop, like, or you even like, or you really have to use some AI pre-processing for that?
I'm sorry.
I mean, you can use some Photoshop, let's say, filters that can make it work, I think. But or you really have to use AI pre-processing?
No. I mean, I didn't use AI. I used hand pen tool in order to get the mask that I used most of all. I'm sure Photoshop has a number of these tools, and you can always clean them up in here. But I'm just showing you, this is a workflow that I use in Comfy UI a lot when I want to see different guidance models and how they might create and how might they work. Down here we also get depth models with a heat map. You can see that all depth models are not created equally. Some of them are better than others, some of them are more exaggerated than others, some of them have a lot more detail. You can see what this one does with it as opposed to this one over here where the altar is completely warped. And so I'll just run this workflow a lot of times. Like this one is really clean. You can see I get a lot of detail in the altar area, and even in the chandeliers I'm getting individual separation of these little strands.
Which one is that one?
This one is coming from Depth Anything V2, and it's usually my go-to. But sometimes you'll find that you're actually getting better results with a shittier model because maybe you don't want super detailed. Maybe you just want it to be like general, and the super detailed one is a little bit too strict. So in this particular case where I'm actually trying to map something to a real world object, having a lot of detail is really good for me. But if I just want to use creative guidance from an input, then it might not be. Hey Marcel, nice to see you. So I use this workflow whenever I need to just test an image and to try to make an educated guess as to what kind of preprocessor is going to be best for me. And you can see there's a bunch of these that are bypassed. So depending on what kind of image I'm working with, I might want poses, right? If I'm using a human being, I might want to get like a skeleton estimation from it. Hands. If I'm doing something that might be turned into a 3D model, there's really good generative 3D models now with like Hunyung 3D or some of the other Tripo 3D AI models. And so I might want to see what the normals or the bump maps are going to look like when I process that. So this is just like a workflow that I keep in my utilities folder, and I whip it out whenever I kind of want to do a really quick analysis of what's going on here. So the next thing that I did once I had a strong map and was pretty happy with how that was looking was I went through and I created just a fuck ton of images using ControlNet. And ControlNet is a stable diffusion tool that takes these different kinds of pre-processed inputs, edge or depth or scribble estimation, and gives me a guidance map that I can use with stable diffusion. And I think I let this run overnight with an LLM prompt in the loop. I picked some of the good ones and some of my favorite prompts from that, and I iterated again. And so I just basically went through and generated maybe 1,000, 2,000 images overnight, and then manually curated the best of them. And then I ran it through a script that a friend of mine turned me on to. It basically uses the traveling salesman problem in order to solve for perceptive similarity. So based on shape and color, basically what this script does is I point a folder of images at the script, and then it goes through and it compares every image to every other image, and then renames those images in an order based on which ones are closest to each other. And this is a really cool process because, you know, I'll shoot an event sometimes, or I'll just have a huge folder of images, and they're not shot in any kind of order, and I'd want to see similar subject matter or similar color schemes laid out next to each other, especially if they're not chronological. I've used this with time-lapse photography, I've used this with fashion shoots, I've used this with just event photography, you know, if I shoot an event for a friend or something, just to sort the images and place them next to each other. So I basically took my favorites here, and then when I run them through the script, it reorders them in such a way whereas these are mathematically somehow closest next to each other in this order, right? It doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be perfect, but it means they're going to be close. And once I have something like that, now I can do all sorts of fun stuff with it, such as run frame interpolation, you know, and now generate a bunch of in-between frames that never existed using AI. I can put 4, 8, 16 new frames between each subsequent frame, and now I get like a subtle, slow blending and morphing. I think I put an example of that in this folder somewhere. Yeah, so this is just taking a folder of images, and now I've set the speed to be kind of slow. We can play with this a little bit more. And I turned on interpolate frames. If I turn that off, you'll see that it's just going to sequentially go through the frames in this folder. But if I turn frame interpolation on, now I get a really slow blend between all of these frames. And so this is an awesome way to use to make some content, because now I could also mask that with, for instance, just one of the masks for just the trim or for just the windows or something, and I have a video layer of content that's slowly moving. The next thing I'm going to do is run a different workflow here. So this is a workflow that uses local AI video models in order to interpolate between these frames. And I'm going to set this to run right now. It's going to take about 10-15 minutes to run the whole thing. But I ran one before y'all arrived, and that looks kind of like... Sorry, I'm on a remote machine in Portugal right now, so there's a lot of latency. So this is using Wan, which is a recent Chinese video model. Actually, this is going to play back really poorly on the other computer. Let me play it locally on this machine. So this endless travel workflow is a really neat thing where you can just put in any number of images and watch as it interpolates between the vehicle. This was a project where I turned a bunch of my friends into Martian swimsuit models. And now I'm interpolating between all of the alien people using these local models. But that's not the one that I want. I want the one Come on, internet. Maybe it'll be just good enough to watch this one. Yeah, that's a little stuttery. But you see it does a really nice job of interpolating between totally different concepts. So that was one of the approaches that I took to creating content for this job. And then another project, or another approach that I took was using a workflow. I used to work for a company called Eden, and Eden is a generative AI toolkit, and one of the workflows that we use is called texture flow. And texture flow is neat because it lets you take a number of different textures and an input guidance shape and create some cool interpolative patterns that take inspiration from the inputs. So I made a folder of really sparse, minimal textures. This is the folder that I made. I wanted a lot of negative space. I wanted this kind of neon look. I wanted organic shapes like ripples in the water or smoky textures or fire, nebula, lightning. And what we ended up with is pretty neat. By taking just that outline and running that through the texture flow workflow, you get really straight on guidance. It's not exactly perfect, but it doesn't need to be for a texture like this. And now to have like this lightning that connects these different parts, or just really sparse lighting effects. Let's see, I really like these ones here. So anyways, I wrote a blog post about this process. For a user that was curious about how he could use these AI tools to projection map his own artwork. And he's already working with projectors on his artwork. And so he was just curious how these AI tools might be applicable to doing something like this. And I've done a lot of work with projecting on paintings, things like murals. This was a mural at EDC in Las Vegas, and having these kind of trippy situations where you've got a lot of different layers to work with is always interesting because it's someone else's art. You don't want to be too heavy-handed. You want to find a way to fit in with what's there and accentuate it without just distracting from it and slapping random video on top of something that exists already. And so, I used to work with an artist where he would paint these large-scale murals. This is on a huge 10 meters tall wall, and while he would paint, I would go through and map different parts of that and fill it up with color. And so we would do these performances together. And so I have a little bit of experience with how one might go about the problem of putting in video onto this. And so showed how creating your masks first in something like Photoshop is always going to be a great place to start. And then we can use these as shape guidance. And just throwing these through a normal video or image processor, by now, there's Midjourney, there's OpenAI, ChatGPT, there's Runway ML, Google's stuff is really great. So there's a lot of different companies, and there's also a lot of different open source models that will allow you to train on your own artwork, or to take your own input images, your sketches and drawings, or in this case, photographs of real world objects that you want to make content to match, and using that as kind of an initialized guidance image. You see here that there's these ways of creating different types of depth maps or shape maps, edge detection, and then you can make an unlimited number of variations on the original part while sticking to the shape in a way that allows you to interpolate between them or blend them together or take them into whatever your post-production pipeline might look like, whether that's Photoshop or DaVinci or Blender or what have you. And when you're done, you get these really interesting new ways of taking the shape that's already there, or taking your own artwork and adding some sort of animation or motion that, maybe you could do this sort of thing if you have the skill set in traditional animation tools, but with minimal effort now, you can take an idea that you have for your own art or for a collaboration and execute that relatively quickly. I think for this church gig, I found out about the job 4 days before I was supposed to be in New York in order to execute it. And all that I had to go off of was a single imperfect picture. And so it was just kind of a pipeline of taking what I had to work with, building out like all the assets that I might need, guidance and shapes and templates in order to set myself up for success. And then bringing those into Touch Designer or into Blender, you can create different planes or different masks that are used for lighting, for feedback, for mixing and matching different chunks of pre-rendered content that you already have in order to make something. So yeah, I think that's the main gist of what I wanted to share about this projection mapping project. And it's also, really cool to just remix stuff. Like, this was a happy accident. This wasn't what I wanted it to do, but it was kind of cool, and now is useful, maybe not for this particular project, but just as a generalized VJ clip, or something that could be used elsewhere in a different project. Does anybody have any questions, comments, snide remarks?
Yeah. You were talking about travel salesman problem.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you measure closeness in pixel space, right?
So, I'm not exactly sure which parameters this is using. It's using like k-means sampling and some other clustering. I don't know how much it's working on like shape or color, but it seems to be a combination of both.
Okay.
I didn't write the script, and I don't pretend that I understand all the math. I just know that it gives me a decent way to perceptually. I mean, we can look it up. So the script itself. So we're using Torch, and we're
Uh-huh.
using the TSP solver library. Yeah, LPIPs. So it's doing something to measure perceptual distance.
Okay, okay. I will take a look.
Yeah. Yeah, LPIPs. Do you know more about this? No. I, am deeper in some areas than others. I'm a master of several trades and a jack of a lot more. So there's, big, deep gaps in my understanding, especially around the math.
Thank you for sharing the screen so I can take a look after that.
Yeah, absolutely. I've forked this also into a node for ComfyUI, and that makes it really easy to use when I just load in a batch of folders, and then I can tell it to sort, by date or by title, randomly, or by visual path. And so I just have a little drop-down menu for myself in a folder node, and that means I can just take kind of any batch of things and know that they're going to come out close-ish. It's not perfect. I'm still actually trying to figure out some other ways that I want to sort, either by color or by shape. Ignore certain things, maybe have a flag to desaturate first. I've found this script to be super useful for a number of weird tasks.
For the part where you generate a bunch of inspiration pictures for the projection, what were the prompts set? Did you just download like a random one, or you like
Are you
curated?
talking about these textures here?
No, for the chart you generated like different things before you sorted them, right?
Yeah, so one of the things that I wanted to go with, I think in a lot of these prompts, was James Turrell. So James Turrell does these really beautiful lighting installations where he's hiding the source of light behind different apertures, and works a lot with neon and with forced perspective. So James Turrell lighting, neon, minimal, high contrast, negative space. I don't want it to always be full color, so some of them I was going for like the least amount of light as possible, so that I had a lot more space to interpret.
Did you have a set of individual prompts, or you just iterated the seed?
What I usually end up doing is a couple of things. First of all, there's like one comfy package called like one button prompt or magic prompter or something like this that just has like crazy sliders and throws a fuckload of adjectives at thing. And so I'll let that run randomly for a while, and then cherry pick a couple that I like, and then I'll look at the prompts and see if I can recognize any of the words that were being used that were helpful for achieving the image that I liked. I also have long lists, like a document of prompts that have been successful for me before, different adjectives. I did something really similar at the Mars College residency this year, projection mapping on a building using this exact technique. And for this, actually, that's on the. So a lot of these were prompts that were already successful for me. But this was the outline of a palette rack structure, and I wanted to get some of these fire looks, I wanted to get some of these water looks. So using image guides that I like, kind of having this palette of curated minimal textures that have worked for me in the past, I'll hang on to those. And then you can see some of the kinds of words that I'm using: sparse, high contrast, crushed blacks, caustic light, prismatic reflections, chromatic aberration, reflections on industrial surface, minimalist composition, symmetrical. here we have prompts like sparse, crushed black, high contrast, amber neon bar lights, architectural lighting, symmetrical, minimalist composition. So I'm finding words and then reusing them a lot, and I'll generate a lot of different variations and then just cherry pick the ones that are interesting or useful to me. And I found that like actually the more sparse the better. Something like this works really well on texture flow. And another thing that was interesting to observe was that different control nets were giving me really radically different outputs. So, where did that go? So a lot of these I did 2 variations on with different control net processors. And here's a really good example. This one, you can see the control net that we ended up using was the Anyline preprocessor. And if you notice, these arches here are solid. And then I ran the exact same job with all the same parameters and inputs and settings. The only difference is I'm using canny edge detection, and you see that these bars are not solid. It's just the outlines. So all of these just used my input mask here. I tried the same thing with the church itself and found much better luck only using my hand-drawn mask. Gave me nice results. Any other questions?
You showed that you use Resolute, but only for just workspace. Do you use Resolute for anything else, or?
I did all of the performance in Resolute. So here's different chunks. Unfortunately, this isn't the computer that I used, and all the masks. I made a plugin for the masks per layer, and I don't have that on this machine, so I can't mix and match those in the same way that I would want to otherwise.
So the performance itself is from Resolute, not from Touch Designer, right?
I will use Touch Designer running in parallel with it.
Oh, okay.
And now what's cool is somebody last year made an FFGL wrapper for the Touch Designer engine, which means you can actually take Touch Designer projects and package it and then run that from inside of Resolute.
Nice.
And in a lot of ways, this is the best of both worlds because Touch Designer is single-threaded, which means you need to do a lot of resource management to keep from running out of resources. It's actually really hard to use Touch Designer in a performant way when you have like lots of different scenes and compositions. But by packaging individual modules from Touch Designer into Resolute plugins, now you can control them just like a clip, and that makes it really, really versatile.
Can you repeat the name of the plugin?
The name of which plugin?
Which imports in
Touch Designer scenes.
Yeah.
The
Into
Touch Designer
Resolute.
one? The Touch Designer in Resolute is called FFGL Touch Engine. If you just look up Touch Designer FFGL Resolute, you'll find it eventually. Yeah, FFGL Touch Engine by Med Accelerator. This is the one.
All right,
Cool.
done.
Yeah, I think so. If there's no more questions, maybe we take.
Well, we just hang out. Anybody who has questions is here. We're gonna be here, and then
Yeah, you want to take like a 15-minute break, and then we'll put on the Hackers movie if people want to stick around for that.
yeah.
Cool.
Sounds good.
Thanks for coming.